Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And for you out there in podcast land, welcome. I have to apologize. No, I don't. I'm going to apologize to begin with for soft pedaling stuff last time and eating around the edges about bee problems and so on. It's really more frightening than that. And Bob and I were just speaking just before our 1:30 appointment with you about, well, we were thinking of a name for the podcast, which might be Unabashed. And unabashed. It also means unvarnished truth. In other words, having a discussion with you in which we posit certain things which you might disagree with. But I think it's time, as you may have seen in the press about the climate change movement and so on, it's really time to act. And the things so the important thing about that is somebody has to call you to act. And if you can't call yourself to act, then maybe our discussions might help. And that's our point of spending time. Your time is precious. Our time is precious. We don't want to waste our time. We don't want to waste your time. And so let's go, Bob. What do you got this week?
Well, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, and I want to mention again, relative to Unabashed, the conversations that you and I have, neither one of us hold back. We make bold statements if we have bold opinions. We're not worried about being challenged on those opinions. In fact, we invite that, and that's very much the spirit of this podcast. If we say things that someone disagrees with, for me, when that happens, it makes me think. It makes me re-examine, why do I believe the way I do believe about that particular issue. You were talking earlier, of course, we have spoken about one of the superlative issues, climate change. We're at a point where we cannot afford to be wrong on this one. We're not going to get a second chance again after 46,000 chances. We are at to use a technical term, an inflection point, or possibly beyond one. And we've even, quoted in the past couple of podcasts that, this is the future that we most likely are looking at. So what can we do? So trying to take a constructive view of what reality is, but first presenting reality. And I think we've already done that. But we did talk a little bit before we started today about GMO, which is another really significant issue, which has, in a very real way, contributed to the consequences we're realizing of climate change and of changes in our food stock, of changes every day that, we go to the grocery. GMO corn, for example, in this country, a very significant issue. It's subsidized. So the government is trying to make ethanol, it more right. Yeah,
let's make it into something you can put in our gas tanks.
Well, and make it into something that you can also put into hundreds and hundreds of different products in the grocery store that you don't even realize contain GMO corn. In many cases, it's a product that you don't even associate with corn, but it's packaged in a container that's either coated with or has a label made with GMO corn products. So it's permeated our entire existence in this country, and our food. You were mentioning again before we started, but just some things to pick up on. Beef, a cow, whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist or like me, both, a cow was at some point created and a cow has evolved, and cattle have multiple stomachs. Those stomachs were created for and evolved to be very efficient at eating and digesting grass. And when you try to put something else into those stomachs that they were not designed for, you get a byproduct that's quite significant. It rhymes with grass. It's called gas. And that gas is having a massive impact. And if you're not familiar with the impact that gas from commercial feeding operations of cattle, that gas is producing huge problems, impacting the environment in a huge way. And there are a few companies that their profitability to them is far more significant than what they're doing to the air that we need to breathe, the planet that we need to live on. And, as we said, unabashed. And when you mentioned unabashed, the first thing that came to mind was the statement that I've given to people over the years, over a couple of decades actually, when they've asked me my opinion of investing in Monsanto. Now, Monsanto is no longer available as a stock. It was bought out, I believe it was last year, by Bayer, a huge global conglomerate out of
Can I say the
Germany.
same people who brought you Zyklon B gas? But
for
anyway,
concentration camps.
Yeah.
They've got a wonderful history, and the two of them,
got together.
should be together. It's just that unfortunately they're on this planet. But the short response I would give people, which in many cases shocked people, A, that I gave a short response, and B, that I said it, it's clearly, but I just told them, I said, to me, Monsanto is the corporate embodiment of Satan. And I don't soft shoe that. I really believe if you take your time and look at the history of Monsanto, you look at the research Monsanto conducted, for example, on GMO crops and seeds in India, and all the deaths and huge lawsuits that are associated with that, for example. And that information's freely available. And then you have a company that pays over $60 billion to buy a company with more liability than you can arguably estimate at this point. They've now lost 2 public lawsuits on just one of their many wonderful products, Roundup. And so you have those things going on in the world today, and you have, as a result, huge amount of genetically modified crops that are, just growing at the detriment of our climate and of our health. We don't even have the receptors to digest most genetically modified foods. And so then you go to a small problem, pun intended, obesity. Obesity is a huge issue, especially in the United States. And if you look at GMO calories,
they're just empty calories.
They are.
Right?
They're doing nothing but adding to the obesity issue that we have, which is, a mega billion-dollar health issue in the United States. So all this ties together, and it might be hard to follow, but it is all tied together, and it does all relate. And then you have to ask a question. Well, isn't there a company that said, we believe we should go purely organic? We should serve only organic food. Even though we're a fast food chain, we should serve organic food. And isn't it ironic that shortly after they made that announcement and that corporate change, that all of a sudden they started getting embroiled in multiple instances of food poisoning? That's kind of odd, isn't it? It couldn't have been a coincidence.
Coincidence? Probably not. And it's a death knell of any restaurant to have that you even got a tummy ache from eating there. All of a sudden, I don't care what the Zagat rating is, or and like, oh my God, it's a 5-star. Yeah, but you die if you eat there. So it's pretty effective slander. It doesn't take much. A few press reports that are then modified and amplified by the people who have a vested interest in not growing something with the natural law. So because darn it costs more money to provide value. It just does. I don't care what it is that you're looking at. You want a piece of machinery to last 10 years instead of 2. You're going to have to use better ball bearings. You're going to have to use better materials. You're going to have to, really design it so it'll live for a while and be functional. I mean, that's just on a mechanical basis. So, of course, if you can do high fructose corn syrup, which comes from GMO corn because, well, it's cheaper, then it's in everything. And and the other thing is palm oil. Now, palm oil has one benefit, and it's used in a lot of chocolate because it melts at 80 degrees. Until then, it doesn't. So you can keep that product, and your Hershey bar goes, it's a little soggy. Well, so they said, we'll use palm oil. Well, if you go into your dollar store or wherever you get your snacks, and you just go right down the line and reading the labels, and you will come to palm oil in every product. There's not one cookie you can buy for your kid that doesn't have palm oil in it. Now, you say, well, so it's an oil, it's fine. But, well, yes, except palm oil is so hard that you can just strain it and run it in your diesel motor right off the tree, right into the tank, and that's how hard it is. So you think your arteries, having a problem? You think you're having a problem with stuff you can't digest? Palm oil. If it's not meant to be eaten, it's not. So that's just one aspect of how we are infiltrated. So, Bob, if I want to really say something that will upend everything, is drink water. Don't drink soda. Perfect example. 1 pound is worth 3,500 calories. So if you can reduce 1 500 calorie thing a day in a week, you'll lose a pound of weight a week if everything else being standard. So what do you think a supersize me is? How many calories do you think are in there? Oh my goodness. It's huge. And I see people who, because of the combination of chemicals that are in it, because the body really identifies and likes toxins. Once it has the toxin, it wants more of the toxin. It's like sugar, when it's stripped of all, devoid of any kind of other kinds of minerals that come with it, or in some, like an apple, for instance, which has a way of slowing down that sugar because there's something you chew. You're up the creek. You're just up the creek. So, and you can look at our society and say, well, I don't have time to cook something, or no. What really you're saying is that you believe the commercials. It's what everybody's doing. Just stop doing it. Well, wait a minute. How can I do that? Be social? Well, maybe you're going to have to sacrifice, at least at the beginning, some of your friends. I walk into and I have nothing against people having a beer or wine or whatever. I really love the taste of wine. But what I do is I walk into a brewery and I have an iced tea. And that's just just me. Why? Because for me, that's what I want. So everybody needs to sit down, I think, and decide, what do they want? What is your desire? Do you want to have a healthy planet? Do you want to have food that you can eat and feed your children? What do you want? There's nothing wrong with desire. Find out what it is that you want and go from there. Don't try to, it boggles the mind. Are you prone to depression? You want to turn on the television, and you'll see enough to depress you for, just one day will probably depress you for a month if you're prone to depression. What are you looking at? Well, you're looking at a lot of problems that nobody's addressing. But it's not their fault, it's your fault. You're not addressing your own problem. That's just, that's the bottom line. If we are individually created, I always used to say, if God wanted to experience limitation, he just would have made one human being. What's all this with the billions of human beings? So it can't be all about God experiencing limitation. It has to be something else, which is 8 billion different iterations of desire for the essence of life, which then adds something to the universe. If we want to add something to the universe, it's not going to be some chemical gas. It's not going to be, that's not going to help us. A friend of mine just used the analogy of, well, the white man came to America and crushed the Native Americans' spirit by saying to them, well, you have to send your kids to our schools. You can't speak your own language. Put you on a reservation. We like this land. And multiple times, the poor Cherokees. So they were good farmers in South Carolina, North Carolina. They were really good farmers. And they were so good that their crops were getting more money at the marketplace than the Europeans who came.
Non-GMO corn.
Yeah, well, this was 1600s. So, but the point was that they knew how to farm, and they were sharp people, and they understood nature really well, and they did well. So then along comes my least favorite president, historic least favorite president, Mr. Jackson, who was he won the Battle of New Orleans. He was a big military guy. Everybody said, yeah, Jackson will do a good job. Well, he absolutely ignored the Supreme Court. Perfect case where the Supreme Court said, you can't move these Native Americans off the land. They're farmers. They pay taxes. What are you doing? Oh, yes, we can. And he did. Not unlike a current contemporary president who thinks he can do anything he wants. He did the same thing. Well, so they removed him to Oklahoma. Well, then they discovered oil and gas underneath the reservations in Oklahoma. Oh, my goodness. And they paid him off this and that. And they did all kinds of weird things with pieces of paper, to get that land, and then moved him again. So what am I saying? We have to walk at least a block in their moccasins, because what's going to happen to us? When we as a nation become an imperial power, which, by the way, I don't know if you noticed that we did, and since the Second World War. And when you do that, then you can colonize anywhere you want, because you have the firepower, you have the money, you can bend people's politics, you can do things that are against their best interests. But what do you learn by that? You learn how to do it. And so my thought is very simple. We're being colonized. We've been colonized. We're the third world. Well, they sort of exploited the third world. So now we're the first world. It doesn't matter to them. Right? Somebody famously said, your ignorance or your intelligence. A person will exploit either. They don't care if they're exploiters. What they're doing. So here we are, having corn that isn't going to do us any good. We have calories that don't add up to anything, and they truck them around and put fizzy CO2 water, and they make them sparkle at you. And then, of course, things go better with whatever it is, and you buy it. Why? Well, there's an illusion here that life will be better if it's easier. Now, I don't know if anybody's understood that from grade school, that some people can pass exams pretty easily, but that's probably arguably 1 or 2% of the population have a photographic memory, can get it right away. They have proper nutrition at home. They're not sleep deprived, and they ace the test. But for everybody else, it's hard. It's hard. Well, if you had a tub and some sudsy water and a washboard, and your family has clothes that get grimy, and so your job at home is to use that washboard and try to keep those clothes, clean. Of course, you're going to say, "Wow, a washing machine, a machine that's been around now 100 years, that actually first with a crank and then finally with electricity and whatever." Okay. What have you lost and what have you gained? Well, now you have to go join a health club to get your exercise in, because you're not exercising and you're eating a bunch of empty calories. And then what I call exoskeletons, the cars that we have, were the soft, pudgy things that get into the exoskeletons made out of steel and can transport ourselves. And then we get the soft, pudgy part gets out again. And then what? Well, muscles are meant to be used. And if they're not used, they atrophy. That's what happens when you get sick and go in the hospital and lay for 3 months. Mm-hmm. Not only are you trying to recover from whatever it is that your problem is, now you're actually losing muscle mass, you're actually losing power and so on. Well, politically, that's what we've been doing for forever, but certainly exacerbated by 2 world wars, because now we had an excuse to not do what nature asked us to do. What is a war? It's an ecological disaster. Oh, you think you're going to gain something from it? What are you going to gain from it? What? Tell me what you're going to gain from it. Oh, well, you'll be in control of what? Of the decimated area? What does that mean? And why are you doing it? When was the last time you ate a concept? You know what I mean? Was it nourishing? Because we go to war for concepts. The domino theory in Southeast Asia, we have to stop China. Well, I don't think we stopped China with that war. That was the Vietnam War. We haven't won a war since World War II, except for Grenada. I don't pronounce that. That small little island that welcomed our buying their trinkets. That was a war. We won. Otherwise, no. So what do you say about a country, individuals who allow their country to fight the other, and the other, there is no other, from my point of view. It's challenging. I know you think there are others. So if you disagree with that, please, say what you want.
Well, as you were talking, I mean, you covered a very broad spectrum of issues in that statement. And they are, as we've said, they are all linked. They're all part of the whole. All these things relate to each other. And if you look at things holistically, you do see that all these things are connected. When I was listening, I was thinking about a number of different things as you were speaking, one of which was my rule of books. As a lot of people know, for a couple of years, I put together and facilitated men's groups. And we would talk about significant issues that really matter in life. We got to the point where we were deeply examining those issues after having several different discussions about each of those issues. And what I found in these discussions, because I had the benefit of listening to hundreds of men in these small groups, but they were all small groups, but I listened to many of them address issues. And I found out that the human mind works most of the time in a LIFO fashion, like accounting. The last thing you took in is the first thing that you apply to the situation. LIFO stands for last in, first out. And it's an accounting method. And I think accounting's boring. Hopefully, there are some people out there that get excited about it because we do need accountants. I don't. So I realized in listening to this that when we would be talking about a very significant issue, like what does it mean to be the right kind of father? Or what does it mean to be the right kind of spouse, husband in the case of men's groups? What does that mean? And we would be talking about that and having deep, transparent, honest conversations about that topic, and in many cases about challenges and failures of achieving those things, which are important. And then somebody would speak up. Yep, it's exactly like the article I just read last week on pheasant hunting. And I'm thinking, how does being the right kind of father relate to an article on pheasant hunting? It relates because it was the last thing in that person's mind, and they were applying things from that article to everything they heard. So I'm not big on rules, but if I see a rule that will help with a goal, I'll consider it. And I did. I just propose to each of these groups that we adopt a rule of books. You can't recommend a book unless you read it at least 3 to 5 years ago and it still affects your thinking and your life every week. Because that got rid of the LIFO aspect of introducing things that weren't relative, that were just the last thing someone had read. And what books? There's a question I would ask everybody listening to the podcast. What books did you read more than 3 to 5 years ago that still impact your thinking and your life every week? One of those books that happened to come to me when you were talking was a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, written by Michael Pollan. Mm-hmm. It's a book about much of what we were talking about earlier. GMO. It was a book about our food, understanding our food. Where does it come from? How is it made? What is the food industry like? He was curious about that. So he did a lot of research and then wrote a nonfiction book on the topic that has basically 3 sections. I happened to, years ago, the book was recommended to me and I was getting ready to do a cross-country trip. So I thought it would be interesting for Sammy as well as myself to get the book on, audio, listen to it as we traveled. So we did. And the first section of the book was about one of the topics you talked about, farming, GMO farming specifically. It was about that, and it was about how the food industry operates. And of course, during that discussion, there were 2 things that he wanted to experience and bring out. One was organic farming. What is organic farming compared to commercial farming? How does it look? How do you have a genuine organic farm? He found a farm that he actually went and worked on for a period of time that was a 2nd generation organic farmer in the area outside of Washington, D.C. Farm, it's an old time farm. And this farm, the explanation of how this farm was planned and operated and implemented was one of the most beautiful symphonies I've ever heard about in my life. Every aspect of this farm worked in concert with other parts of the farm. Where did he plant the trees? He planted the trees to block the prevailing winds so that the grasses didn't have to spend 30% of their energy staying upright to realize effective photosynthesis. And that way, when the cows ate the grass, not grain, when they ate the grass, they got 30% more energy in that grass. And how did he prevent the cows from eating too much of the grass in the pasture? He developed movable pastures, movable fences, and he would let the cattle graze for a certain period of time. And fascinating how cattle innately know what kind of grass they need for their metabolism individually, not collectively. Each cow, when they went into a new field, he called them salads. They would know exactly what they needed and how much of it and what combinations they needed to be, for it to be nutritious. And then he also followed up, because cow piles are a result of cattle grazing in a field. And after a certain period of time, those cow piles would have a lot of grubs in them. Huh. And those grubs are really nutritious and produce a lot of protein in the yolk of an egg. So the chickens would be moved around to graze a certain period of time after the cattle were moved off that acreage. And it was just, again, I'm only covering 2 of 100 different instruments that played together to make a symphony in this farm. And if you read about it, you're sitting there going, why isn't agriculture like this? Because of commercial industrial farming. And weirdly, as a coincidence, we were driving from Colorado into Nebraska to visit the only organic farmer on the southern border of central Nebraska. And we were going to visit him to help him harvest for a few days because we just happened to have met him through my daughter and son-in-law. They tour all the time. And so we were headed to his place to just see his organic farm operation and help him harvest. And as we were getting into Nebraska, the section on corn, an entire section of this book is on corn.
Right.
And that section began, and we thought, isn't this a coincidence? Because when you're driving from Colorado into Nebraska and all the way to central Nebraska, you do see quite a bit of corn. In fact, you don't see hardly anything other than corn. And we were driving along, and it was one of the most eerie experiences I've ever had in my life, because I'm listening to a story about organic corn and GMO corn. And then he graduates into what organic or what GMO corn actually is like. And I'm looking at these crops, and these crops, every single stalk for miles was exactly the same height. And every stalk had an ear of corn at the same place and the same number of ears of corn. And the only way you knew you went to the next farm was a little bit difference in the height of the crop. But for the better part of an hour, as I recall, every little sign that told what kind of seeds they were using was Pioneer 1160 genetically modified corn. And so it was all the same.
Yeah.
It was like the futuristic movie you see of every person being the same, dressed
clones,
the same, acting the same.
clones.
And so it was an eerie experience, no pun intended, since they were ears of corn. But I mean, it really was fascinating. And the contrast between what has happened in Nebraska with industrial farming, from what used to be, I believe it was the 64-acre family farm that would feed a family of 4. There was enough acreage that you could grow your own food, have your own livestock. You could grow enough food to sell to support your family, to buy the things that you couldn't grow, and to provide a home. And that went from the average farm, I believe that was the size of the average farm 100 plus years ago, to then when the rail tracks came in and the farms became industrial farms. Now the average farm is in the thousands of acres. The average farmer is growing exclusively GMO crops, and corn, as we mentioned earlier, is subsidized. So again, this is a book. I don't recommend many books because of my own rule. I do follow my own rules. I know that's not typical, but that book happens to be a book that I did read over 3 to 5 years ago that is still impacting everything I see and the lenses through which I view these issues all these years later.
Well, these trends are not overnight trends. And I've always been interested in history of how things develop. And you may have read or not, or heard about something called the Dust Bowl and the tremendous problem of losing topsoil in the 30s. And that was
during the Depression. Interesting how depressions bring on natural calamities. So
and vice versa.
Yeah.
The Ford Motor Company had devised a tractor. The hydraulics they stole from an old friend of my father's. He was a house mover, and they decided that they liked the hydraulics that could lift houses, and just took his invention. But he said, "That's okay. I have more ideas." He wasn't one of those people who worried about it. 24 hours a day, a father and a son with lights on the tractor could literally do furrows, 12-hour shifts, and continually for the owners who were on the east side of New York City in the upper 90s, who had never seen a farm. But this was a great new investment because they looked at the numbers, 2 guys, tractor, price of beets or whatever they wanted to grow, and started cranking up the topsoil. And of course, Mother Nature says, this year I'm going to do a lot of wind this year because last year I didn't do a lot, and who knows what's happening next year. But this year I'm just going to blow a lot. Well, so all the topsoil's off. And guess what happens when you don't have topsoil? You can't plant crops. So then you can't feed people. no stand of trees to keep the wind broken in a small enough section so that you can actually have a fecund farm, one that will really pay off in terms of the vibrancy of the food and how it's grown, and the chickens and the cows and the whole thing. That just accelerated. It just accelerated and accelerated through the Second World War. We had to feed the troops. Now, there's a concept which drives a disaster, as far as I'm concerned. It's always taking your eye off of the immediate problem and saying, oh, yeah, I know that's a terrible idea, but we have to ... and whatever that concept is, So the Greeks, little short tidbit, Pericles, Western Europe prides itself, the Germans and the English, about the Greeks and how they were the Plato and Aristotle and all of this, and they're very, very much enamored of those classical thought, and they're pretty amazing thinkers. Of course, their society ran on slaves. We don't talk about that, but they had concepts, and so what happened? Well, the Spartans and the Athenians, and the Spartans were militaristic. Long story short, the best and the brightest said, let's just bring the farmers into the city. We can defend the wall. We have the biggest fleet in the world. We have, easily 200 or 300 triremes, with these slaves pumping the oars. Never be defeated. Well, Athens wasn't built for 50,000 people. It was only built for about 25,000. Bubonic plague broke out because the sewer system wouldn't handle the influx of all these people. It had a sanitation problem. And I said, well, how is that different from what's happening now? Our water is going to hell. Our atmosphere is being poisoned. But the Russians haven't invaded because we spent all of our money on military armament to keep them out. And so then what happens? Well, disease. I mean, we act as if we're not part of nature. We act as if we can just do whatever we want. Well, you can, but there's a price. It's yes, you're given free will. You go for it. Make your mistakes, but you still will pay for it. I've been interested in Sufi thought, which has a lot of stories, and the story is that a king wanted to get a new treasurer, and he didn't. Well, how am I going to select the new treasurer? So he gets his trusted servants, 6 of them, lines them up, and says, "Here, each of you hold this priceless goblet, this beautifully etched, fabulous work of art." And okay, so they all did. And then he came along and he said to each one of them, "Drop that." Well, he's the king, just said to drop it. Drops it. Why did you drop that? Because you told me to. Next guy, same thing. 5 times, comes to the last guy. His name is Ayaz. Anyway, and he says, "Oh." He drops it. King says, "Drop it." He drops it. He says, "Why did you drop that?" "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said. He took responsibility for his action. And so he became the new treasurer, because now I've got a guy who at least will take responsibility for his actions. These other people they're not that he used to be. But that really made all the other courtiers really mad. So they plotted and schemed and so on. And they saw that every day at a certain time, Ayaz would go into the royal treasury, and they spread the word that he was stealing. And well, the king said, "I don't believe it." Well, so, okay, so let's put a little hole in there in the back side of the treasury vault, and we'll take a look and see what he's doing in there. So they do. And Ayaz goes once a day. And what he does is, what the king sees after he looks in the spy hole is Ayaz takes off all of his courtly garments, puts back on the servant's garb that he had when he came to the palace, and says to the mirror, Ayaz, you're nothing without the king. He's given you everything. And just became humble again. And the king said, yes. And so they opened the vault door and they say, aha, And they said, what's going on? And he said, well, the courtiers decided that you were stealing something, and you have been. My heart. What's the story about? Individual responsibility? How is there GMO corn? Because I have stock in Archer Daniels Midland, or I have stock in you name it, and those prices are going up, and I'm getting the benefit. Well, what benefit is it going to be? As the Native American chief in 1820 said to the white man, he asked him two questions. You think that the white man has singled you out to kill your people? He said, oh, no. He kills his own brother. And then he said to him, and one day the white man will realize you can't eat money, because the white man always wanted to buy the land from which he didn't own anyway, because it was a gift from God. And so what I'm saying is, challenge yourself to find areas in your life that you can own, and challenge yourself to what you want. What do you want? You want, what do you want? Are you a corporation who decides that if I have a new car next year, I will be a success? Or what? Where are you going to invest yourself? You talk about investments, what's the greatest investment? Well, your parents may have invested the money to send you to college if they had any. They may have invested their time and effort in helping you to study. They may have done the best they could, whatever it was, because of their investment in your heart, in who you are. So are you going to say no thanks, or say I don't care, or are you going to continue the investment? Are you going to continue to add to that wealth that they gave you? Forget religions and concepts of God and concepts of the universe. What's your universe like? What's my universe like? What do I do? And that's an ongoing question. It's not an answer. I'm not giving an answer. I'm not saying do anything. Break the crystal. Why did you do it? Because I told you to? No, because you broke the crystal. You let it slip out of your hand. So there's law, and then there's integrity. There's law, and then there's honesty. There's law, and then there's integrity and what you might call morality, or your own sense of what's right. And how many shows are on television about law and order? And it's a closed system. Once you get in the jaws of justice, it's not about any of those other things. It's about law. And what's greater than law? Well, we have one philosopher a couple thousand years ago who said, I didn't come here to do away with Moses's laws. I just want to add one more. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's a real problem, Bob. That is a huge problem. Why is that? I don't know. Amin, why? Says Bob. Because we don't love ourselves. We have no reference. We can't love our neighbor. We don't like what we're doing. And there's somewhere in us, there's some barometer that exists as we were born that has an innate sense of life. And if you look around right now, how much life do you see? You see depressed people taking Xanax and other. What do you see? Who is in your neighborhood? Who's in your house? And why isn't that corrected? I don't think people would go and overindulge in whatever they're overindulging in if they were satisfied. It's a secret mystical phrase. Satisfaction. find what's really satisfying to you and keep looking. Find out what satisfies you. And it probably won't be what they're advertising. That's why I bet anyway.
Well, you've said repeatedly, ask yourself, what do you want? When someone asks you how you are, I'm fine. It's a standard response. And one of the things that's interesting is to follow up with someone you care about. How are you really? Because most of the time you're going to get a different answer. You're piercing just the shallow level of interaction that goes with just walking by someone or happening upon someone at a place or on a sidewalk. How are you really? If you really get into a discussion of how you are, it's similar to asking the question, what do you really want?
Right. Those are two different things.
As opposed to, but it's a deeper level. It's trying to be honest with yourself and truthful with yourself, not wanting what you happen to be told you want in advertising. Right. That you're bombarded with, the noise that we fight every single day in society, because we now have so many different forms of communication that come flying at us in so many different ways and from so many different directions.
In 7-second sound bites.
And it's also interesting that when you mentioned that philosopher who said, I want to add one thing, doing to others as you would have them do unto you, or love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that question you posed, it's a huge question. How do you love yourself? And I'm not talking about how do you love yourself. I'm saying, do you even love yourself? And if so, in what way do you love yourself? What do you love about yourself? And until you love yourself, not being kind to others might be the way you love yourself. And so you do need to examine that. It's a healthy thing to do. It's interesting that many times that's not even pointed out, from a pulpit, to examine what that really means and to stop and look at how you love yourself. And are you focused inward or are you focused outward? With that particular philosopher, everything I've observed about him and his life and everything written about his life and what he said and did, he was outwardly focused on others. Certainly didn't conduct himself in that way or say those things or take those risks or have that death for his own benefit. It was for others. And it's interesting that, to me, fascinating to me, that particular individual was arguably the most anti-religious individual in history. And yet the majority of people who think they're following his example are doing it with religion, which leads me to an old statement. Well, old for me. I heard the statement many, many years ago. Again, a statement that just constantly comes back to my mind. Too often, people have mistaken religion for God and walked away from them both.
Oh, yeah.
And it is interesting. You were talking about what do you want? I've asked people quite often in serious, deep personal conversations that get well past the weather and gee, hope it rains tomorrow. I've asked them, what is your personal theology? It's a very interesting question. It's also surprising to me how many people have not even stopped to identify it. They have adopted someone else's or some other institution's theology and teachings and dogma.
I think that's true. But if there are 800 and some odd million Catholics, for instance, there are 800 and some odd million different Catholicisms. Because you have to understand that we filter everything. It comes through our senses, our brains, our hearts, how we interpret what a philosopher says, how we use it and weaponize it to make money with it, what do we do with it, is ultimately up to each individual. And that's the key I found in my own life to mental health, and to get up in the morning and go, what's happening today, is because I've honored my own eccentricities. In the 60s was, you are the person that your parents warned you against. In other words, re-examine where you come from, what their values were, which ones you want to adopt, which ones you don't think is worth adopting, because you are you. And I have some people know I have a Down syndrome son who's now 35, and we went to a weekend seminar on the ego, because the ego is very important. It's an organizing principle. Without it, you walk into the street and get hit by a car because you have no sense of yourself. That's off the deep end the other way. But after 3 days of concentrating on the ego, the director of the seminar came over to us as we were leaving. We're down in Sarasota, Florida, and he knew Oliver, my son, and he said, Oliver, so what did you get out of this seminar? Well, if you know anything about Down syndrome people, they have usually a limited, in certain ways, certainly a limited intellect, in which you would say, what's 4 plus 4, whatever. That part of their is not functioning really well. Well, what does that allow for? It allows for no filter. And so when they meet,
unabashed.
He has never not remembered the name of a person he's met.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because he's not doing anything else. When he meets him, you're Bob. I remember you from 10 years ago, because I wasn't thinking about what was for dinner. I was right there. So he said, what'd you get out of the seminar? And Oliver, in his typical fashion, said, well, you might say, if it wasn't for me, I wouldn't be here.
Mm.
Which to me is like an amazing Zen koan from the Zen master, who says something which doesn't add up. It's like, wait a minute. What did you say? He said, if it wasn't for me, my filter, I wouldn't be here. Or as somebody says usually, well, you have to be yourself. Everyone else is taken. But we don't do that. We want to be like someone else who's popular. We want to be like someone else who's done this before. We want to take an easy and relatively psychologically dead approach to, out of what? Out of fear of something. Certainly not out of love. Because love attaches you to something, even to your own soul, to your own self, to your concept of God, to whatever it is. Fear just keeps you hunkered down in your bunker, and you come at people with this layers of pretension, can't make, you make that first impression, can't make it second time, you got to bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
And okay. So it comes down to, in this Western society, because we're not talking about some other society, although corporate society and the international definition of a human being has shifted to mean an immortal being with a board of directors who can continue to amass everything they want, because they don't die. It doesn't die. It keeps going on and on and on. Well, that's a problem. That's maybe a problem for a different time, but we have the capacity to be ourselves. What did God give us? And if you don't want to use the word God, fine. You woke up, and somebody was taking their finger and going back and forth, and you were looking at it. They're trying to determine if you're tracking, trying to see if you have a brain. See if you're sound, are you okay? Are you, the normally healthy person, baby thing, with all its potentials? And there you are. And then someone looks into you and smiles. And you are a tabula rasa, you're a clean slate. And you look up and go, oh, that's who I am. That's how I could be. and you smile. Or you're in a war zone and you have just been born and loud noises are going off. Luckily, your hearing isn't developed first 30 days, so you're not hearing all that stuff, but people around you are frightened. Oh, that's how I am. I react that way. You know, so when are we going to own ourselves? To get to the bottom of ourselves, we are, according to the Western religious tradition, a Judeo-Christian tradition, made in God's image. Nobody talks about that. What does that mean?